Jupiter in the 8th house in all 12 zodiac signs. Let's start off with a refresher about what Jupiter itself represents. Basically, it's the planet of positivity. Positivity basically is a plus sign. So Jupiter represents everything that a plus sign represents, like increase. That's why it has to do with growth, and that's why it also has to do with prosperity or success. Because it represents increase, it represents creation. And that is why it has to do with reproduction and children. And because it has to do with reproduction and children, it represents parenting. And that's why it has to do with role models and parental figures like teachers, priests, gurus, and so on. And that in turn is why it has to do with what we get from teachers and priests and parental figures. Wisdom, which is why Jupiter is all about philosophy and religion, or in other words, ethics. Another sense of positivity is optimism. And that's why Jupiter has to do with trust and faith. Now that we're refreshed about Jupiter, let's refresh ourselves on the 8th house. The 8th house is the section of the sky that is just above the western horizon. So it represents the wind and the rain that weathers or erodes the west. Whatever the west symbolizes, the 8th house is going to symbolize the erosion of it. So for example, the west, because it's the place of sunset, it signifies disappearance. And so the 8th house is fundamentally anti-disappearance. This is why it represents insight, the ability to see things that are difficult to detect. And that's why it also has to do with mysticism, the occult, the ability to see things that other people don't see, invisible things, intangible things. Another sense of being anti-disappearance is to be anti-death. And so the 8th is the house of life force. Because it's the house of life force, it has to do with your lifespan, your longevity, and the way that you're going to die. Because it has to do with life force, it has to do with the way that we generate life force, which is sexuality. Another thing about the western horizon is that it represents other people, because the sun setting represents the ego setting and the importance of other people rising. And so therefore the 8th is sort of anti-others. So in other words, it's not for the benefit of others, but for the benefit of us. So the 8th house has to do with personal gain, the way that we benefit from others, gifts that people give us, inheritances that we get. And also anti-others means nonconformity or individuality. So the 8th house has a defiant nature to it. Now that we are refreshed about what the 8th house represents and what Jupiter represents, it's not difficult to make sense out of what Jupiter means when it's in the 8th house. All you have to do is put the two symbolisms side by side and see where they are on the same topic. For example, Jupiter represents religion and the 8th house represents mysticism, which are very, very similar things. So when Jupiter is in the 8th house, it signifies a person who is quite spiritual. Now, the type of spirituality is going to depend on the rest of the factors that are surrounding Jupiter in the 8th house. It can range from anything to being a spiritualist, to being a religious type of person, or to just being otherworldly. It doesn't necessarily have to be theistic spirituality. So, for example, look at these people with Jupiter in the 8th house. Paramahansa Yogananda, a great spiritualist. Bhaktivedanta Prabhupada, a great spiritualist. Stephen Arroyo, an important astrologer. And Albert Einstein, a scientist, a theoretical scientist, basically a philosopher. Another thing about Jupiter in the 8th house is that Jupiter represents honesty, but the 8th house represents personal gain. So Jupiter in the 8th house symbolizes openness or transparency in areas in which people usually are not. So we can say that Jupiter in the 8th house signifies a person who's principled. We can call this being principled, in the sense that they don't really hide what they're doing. Also, they will tend to even sacrifice their personal gain, something that they believe in, something that they value. So there's people that we already looked at also really illustrate this very well. These people are living for a cause. Paramahansa Yogananda, Prabhupada, Stephen Arroyo, Albert Einstein, they're sacrificing, they're dedicated. And take a look at another batch of people with Jupiter in the 8th, quite a few politicians or political activists. Gandhi, Joe Biden, Jacques Chirac, and Ron Kovic. Another thing about Jupiter and the 8th is that Jupiter represents trust, but the 8th house is about critique. Critique relies on distrust. The reason why we critique is because we don't trust that it's okay. So a person with Jupiter in the 8th house is not particularly trusting. They tend to be skeptical. Therefore, they are not suckers. They're not easy to fool. They are kind of pessimistic about what you're telling them. They're going to check to see if it's really true. So these people that we've looked at already really well signify this, especially a person like Ron Kovic. Finally, a fourth important thing about how Jupiter reacts with the 8th house. Jupiter represents reproduction, and the 8th house represents sex. So Jupiter in the 8th house represents having a lot of vitality, a lot of potency, virility, and therefore also being quite charismatic or attractive. So here's another group of people with Jupiter in the 8th house that are very attractive and sexually kind of appealing or active. Aretha Franklin, Tina Turner, Gigi Hadid, and Bruce Springsteen. Now, all these people match Jupiter in the 8th house pretty well in different ways, but each one has Jupiter in the 8th house in a different zodiac sign. And that's the next thing that we want to talk about. How does the particular sign that Jupiter is in affect the basic nature of Jupiter in the 8th house? We'll start off with Jupiter in Aries in the 8th house. Now, if Jupiter is in Aries, that means that the 4th and the 7th Lord is in the 8th house. So to understand Jupiter in a particular zodiac sign, take everything that you know about it, put it side by side, and see where things are on the same page or not. So the 4th and the 7th Lord in the 8th house represents a person who's quite psychological in how they internally operate and how they interact with others. They operate in a psychological or mystical way. Well, that goes together with Jupiter just being in the 8th house to begin with, because it's very spiritual. So the first thing that we would expect about a person with Jupiter in Aries in the 8th house is that their spirituality is kind of like a psychological insightfulness. They have insight into the way that minds and emotions work. Another thing is that Jupiter in the 8th house had a lot of sexual vitality, and the 4th and the 7th Lords in the 8th house have this weird polarity to it. It's regarding sexuality. It's either going to be a hypersexual or a hyposexual, and you have to look at the surrounding conditions to understand which is which. So our example for Jupiter and Aries in the 8th house is Paramahansa Yogananda. His birth data is in the text below in the description of the video. So we can look at this chart and we can ask, why is this particular individual so spiritual? Yes, Jupiter in the 8th house has a basic out-of-the-box interpretation of indicating a spiritual person. And so does the 4th and 7th Lords in the 8th house. But why is this person so extremely spiritual? In his chart, Jupiter in the 8th trines the moon in the 12th and the first Lord in the 4th. So it's uniting all the moksha-kona, the moksha trine. And moksha is spirituality. Now we said that Jupiter in Aries in the 8th is usually either hyper or hyposexual. And you have to look at the conditions to understand which. Well, this person is a renunciate, a celibate. So that they fit in the category of being quite hyposexual. Why? First Lord joins the 9th Lord in the 4th house. This is giving a combination of dharma and moksha, because the 1st and the 9th Lords carry dharma and they unite in a moksha sthana in the 4th house. So it's taking the person away from kama, which is typical gratification, happiness, and moving them towards dharma and moksha, which is religion, morality, and spirituality. Besides that, he has an exalted Saturn in his 2nd house, aspecting Jupiter, the eighth lord and the first and ninth lord. So that's giving a lot of detachment. Now let's take a look at Jupiter in Taurus in the eighth house. The skepticism of Jupiter in the eighth does really well with the subversiveness of the fact that if Jupiter is in Taurus in the eighth house, it means that the third and the sixth lords are the eighth. So the third and sixth lord in the eighth is very powerful in a subversive way. Also, Jupiter in the eighth having that kind of sexual vitality does very well with the third and sixth lords in the eighth, particularly the third and the eighth, and Jupiter in Taurus being sexually attractive. So Jupiter in Taurus eighth house also indicates having a lot of this vital attractiveness and potency, a lot of libido and attractiveness. Our example for this placement is Gandhi. Birth data is in the description below. Really a perfect match to give a concrete sense of what do we mean by powerful via subversion, non-violent revolution. Why is his chart such a perfect match for this? Well, because his Jupiter in the eighth house is very influential. It's in a mutual aspect with the first lord. We could also ask, how come he's so successful as an activist? It's mainly because his third and sixth lord Jupiter, which is in the eighth house, is in a mutual aspect with the Raja Yoga of the first and the seventh lords. And we may say, what about this debilitated sun? Well, it is the only planet in the Kendra, and the sun alone in the Kendra strongly indicates being involved in government and leadership. But its debility means it's in Libra. So it's going to be going against the king. It's going to be going against the establishment, whose role in government is subversive or anti-authority. Now let's have a look at Jupiter in Gemini in the eighth house. So if Jupiter is in Gemini in the eighth house, it means that Scorpio rises and Jupiter is the second and fifth lord. So Jupiter in the eighth house has a lot of sexual attractiveness or just attractiveness. And so does the second and fifth lord in the eighth. And so does Jupiter in Gemini. All three line up to indicate a very likable or attractive person, particularly in a Gemini sort of way, attractive in how they express themselves. Also, the skepticism of Jupiter in the eighth goes quite well with the research potential of the fifth lord being in the eighth house and the inventiveness of Jupiter being in Gemini. So Jupiter in Gemini indicates somebody that's skeptical of old patterns and tries to invent new approaches to things. Our example of this is Aretha Franklin. Her birth data is in the description below this video. How come she's such a great singer? Well, her second lord, Jupiter, is in Raja Yoga with the first lord. And it exactly aspects the second house. Second house has to do with voice. Jupiter has to do with voice. Furthermore, always look at the 11th, 5th, and 3rd houses for artists and artistic things. So her 11th lord is in the 5th house, very strongly aspecting the 11th house. And her 5th lord, Jupiter, and her 11th lord, Mercury, are in a house exchange. Now let's have a look at Jupiter in Cancer. If Jupiter is in Cancer in the 8th house, that means that Sagittarius is rising. And so that means that Jupiter is the 1st lord and the 4th lord in the 8th. So the skeptical nature of Jupiter in the 8th goes well with the critical nature of the 4th and the 1st lords being in the 8th house. But it has an interesting twist with the optimistic nature of Jupiter being in Cancer. So it indicates a person who is quite analytical or fault-finding without seeming like a jerk, without coming across as a mean person. Actually, they're quite scrutinizing, but they don't come across that way. And then also Jupiter in the 8th being quite spiritual has a lot to do with the 1st and 4th lords being in the 8th, indicating a lot of emotion. And this gives an interesting twist with Jupiter in Cancer being quite honest. So Jupiter in Cancer in the 8th indicates a person that's emotionally deep and fairly open about their morals and open about their opinions and open about their feelings. Our example for this placement is Joe Biden. His birth data is in the description below the video. So why is he the president of the United States? Why is he so powerful? His first lord is Jupiter in Cancer, so that means his first lord is exalted. Now, since his Jupiter is in Cancer, it means the lord of his first lord is the moon, and his moon is also exalted. So his first lord is exalted, and his first lord's lord is exalted, and that is extremely significant. Furthermore, they're not pushed under the rug somewhere. They're in very important placements relative to the rest of his planets. They're both aspecting his other planets. And his other planets include the Sun and Mercury in Raja Yoga as the 9th and the 10th lords. Now let's take a look at Jupiter in Leo. If Jupiter is in Leo in the 8th house, that means that Capricorn is rising. And that in turn means that Jupiter owns the 3rd and the 12th houses. So Jupiter in the 8th already indicates a spiritually active person. But the 3rd and the 12th lords in the 8th really indicates a spiritual or otherworldly kind of person. So Jupiter in the Leo 8th house is a very unusually spiritual person. Furthermore, Jupiter in the 8th is very principled and tends to be hardworking and sacrificing. Same thing with the 3rd and 12th lords in the 8th. They're very passionate about things. So they're going to really give themselves to their ambitions. And the same thing about Jupiter in Leo. It's very brave about its morals, and it wants to influence other people with its morals. So Jupiter in Leo in the 8th house indicates a person who works hard and has a lot of passion to convey their opinions and their ideals to other people. Example of this is Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. His birth data is in the description below. Why is he so spiritual? He's a sannyasi. He's the founder of the Hare Krishna movement. Well, his Jupiter in the 8th house, look closely. It's exactly conjoined Ketu. Furthermore, he has a lot of indicators in his chart for renunciation, or in other words, not really caring about typical things. His 4th lord, 7th lord, and 11th lord are all in the 6th house. His Venus is debilitated in the 9th house. And he has Saturn and Scorpio in his 11th house, aspecting the 1st, 5th, and 8th. Now let's have a look at Jupiter in Virgo in the 8th house. If Jupiter is in Virgo in the 8th house, that means that Aquarius rises. And if Aquarius rises, it means that Jupiter is the 2nd and the 11th lords. So with this one, it's the principled nature of Jupiter in the 8th house going well with the legal nature of Jupiter in Virgo. Because of this, Jupiter in a Virgo 8th house is indicative of somebody who gets involved in management, law, and government. Now, about the 2nd and the 11th lords in the 8th house, that has a lot of sexual virility and vitality to it. And Jupiter in the 8th also had that aspect to it. So Jupiter in the 8th in Virgo also indicates a person that has a lot of libido and is sexually active. Our example for this is Jacques Chirac. His birth data is in the description below. He's certainly a politician. Why? Why is he so much not just a Burger King manager? Why is he a politician? The Aquarius rising with Saturn in it is not something to overlook. It is significant. But that Saturn in Aquarius is square to Venus, who is the yoga karaka for Saturn, the Raja Yoga former for Saturn, in the 10th house, making a square with the first lord making a Raja Yoga. So he's not small-minded and he has a lot of power. Jacques Chirac is also fairly famous as a philanderer, a very high libido, sexually active. Why is he such a good match for that expectation of Jupiter in Virgo? It's not just that he has Jupiter in Virgo. It's that he has Jupiter in Virgo in the 8th house, exactly on the 8th house cusp. So the interpretation of Jupiter in Virgo is quite dominant in this chart. By the way, cusp in the whole sign house system means the most important degree in the sign, and it's identical to the degree of the ascendant. Furthermore, his Jupiter in the 8th house is in a house exchange with the 8th Lord Mercury. So there's an 11-8 house exchange. It's not just the 11th Lord in the 8th house. And his 11th house, by the way, has a lot of important occupants. The 7th Lord, the moon, and the 5th Lord. Now let's have a look at Jupiter in Libra. Jupiter is in Libra in the 8th house. That means that Pisces is rising. And so therefore Jupiter is the 1st and the 10th Lords. But it's really the nature of Jupiter in Libra itself, which is to be very democratic and fair. That is really going to resonate with Jupiter in the 8th house, symbolizing having a lot of principles. So with Jupiter and Libra in the 8th house, we expect a person to have a lot of principles, and those principles will be of a democratic nature, a justice-oriented nature, a fairness nature, people empowering. Regarding the 1st and the 10th Lord in the 8th, that has a lot of skepticism to it. The person is skeptical of the visible things. Therefore, with Jupiter in Libra in the 8th house, the person is very skeptical of the surface of how things appear. They want to research what's really going on. Our example for this is Ron Kovic. His birth data, born on the 4th of July, is in the description below. So why is he a soldier? Well, he has Mars alone in the Kendra, and it's strongly aspecting the ascendant, so you really can't overlook that. Otherwise, besides that, he's obviously a really good match for the basic out-of-the-box Jupiter in Libra in the 8th house. Now let's talk about Jupiter in Scorpio. If Jupiter is in Scorpio in the 8th house, it means Aries must be rising. And if Aries is rising, it means Jupiter is the Lord of the 9th and the 12th. So the spiritual potential of Jupiter in the 8th is being accentuated by the fact that the 9th and the 12th Lords are in the 8th house. But also, the skeptical nature of Jupiter in the 8th is getting along very well with the heterodox nature of Jupiter being in Scorpio. So Jupiter in Scorpio in the 8th house is very spiritual, but not in a very orthodox way. And also the sexual vitality of Jupiter in the 8th goes well with the sexiness of Jupiter in Scorpio, so these people are probably sexy and attractive. Our example for this is Stephen Arroyo. His birth data is in the description below. Stephen Arroyo is a very successful astrologer who was very skeptical of pre-existing astrological norms, calling them old-fashioned and fatalistic. Why is this person an astrologer? Is it necessary that Jupiter in Scorpio in the 8th house produces an astrologer? Not necessary, but it's very easy for it to do so because it's supporting being spiritual in an unorthodox way, in a non-mainstream way. But in his particular case, he has the 8th Lord in the 8th house with the 12th Lord. And he also has the 1st Lord and the 12th Lord in the 8th house. So his 8th house not only is very empowered, but it's got the key players in it to get one interested in mysticism, occult, and astrology. Now, what if Jupiter's in Sagittarius? If it's in Sagittarius in the 8th house, that means that Taurus is rising, which therefore means that Jupiter is the 8th and 11th lords. So the sexiness of Jupiter in the 8th gets really highlighted by the fact that the 8th and the 11th lords are in the 8th house. So what do we think about Jupiter and Sagittarius in the 8th house? Very attractive people. Now add the flavor of Sagittarius into that. So not only are they very, very attractive, but they kind of come across as role models of beauty or teachers or advocates of beauty and arts and so forth. Our example is Gigi Hadid, and her birth data is in the description below. Okay, that fits really well, very attractive. Should everybody with Jupiter in the Sagittarius in the 8th house expect to be as beautiful as Gigi Hadid? No, of course not. So what is it particularly about her chart? Just look at the first house, the house of the body, the house of the appearance. Her 4th lord, the sun, is joining Ketu in the first house, which makes a Raja Yoga, and it's exactly on the ascendant. Her 5th lord, Mercury, with Ketu in the first house, also makes a Raja Yoga exactly on the ascendant. And her 4th lord sun joining the 5th lord Mercury makes a Raja Yoga that brackets the ascendant. So this ascendant is just surrounded by Raja Yogas. Furthermore, her 8th lord Jupiter in Sagittarius is aspecting the 1st lord and also the 7th lord. And it does not hurt to have the moon alone in the 10th house, nor does it hurt to have Venus in Aries when you're a woman. Now let's discuss Jupiter in Capricorn. If Jupiter is in Capricorn in the 8th house, that means that Gemini is rising, which in turn means that Jupiter is the 7th and 10th lords. So the principled, hardworking potential of Jupiter in the 8th house is getting highlighted by the fact that the 7th and the 10th lords are in the 8th house. And also highlighting it is the fact that Jupiter in Capricorn is very Machiavellian, meaning it will do whatever it needs to do to get whatever it wants done. So Jupiter in Capricorn in the 8th house indicates a person that is very hardworking, even when the odds are against them. Furthermore, Jupiter in the 8th house is quite skeptical, and the 7th and 10th lords in the 8th house is also quite critical of appearances. And that is also accentuated by the fact that Jupiter in Capricorn is quite distrusting. So Jupiter in Capricorn in the 8th house, the people are quite skeptical in a sense of being very tough and disbelieving. Our example for it is Bruce Springsteen. His birth data is in the description below. Why, though, is he a singer? As I said before, always watch the 11th, 5th, and 3rd houses for artists. Springsteen's 11th lord is in his 3rd house, while his 3rd lord is in his 5th house. And his 1st and 4th lord Mercury joins Ketu in the 5th house, creating a Raja Yoga there. Now let's discuss Jupiter in Aquarius in the 8th house. If Jupiter is in Aquarius in the 8th house, it means Cancer is rising. And if Cancer is rising, it means Jupiter is the 6th and 9th lords. So the skeptical nature of Jupiter in the 8th is getting highlighted by the fact that the 6th lord in the 8th is super skeptical or problem solving. And the 9th lord in the 8th house is also quite skeptical of patterns, existing patterns, traditions. Furthermore, Jupiter in Aquarius is very iconoclastic. So a person with Jupiter in Aquarius in the 8th house is a good problem solver because of disbelieving common pre-existing approaches to things and being willing to test unusual ideas. Also, the spiritual nature of Jupiter in the 8th is highlighted by the spiritual nature of the 9th lord in the 8th house. So Jupiter in Aquarius in the 8th house is probably best described as indicative of an otherworldly person, in the sense of a person who is quite indifferent to normal things. Our example for this is Einstein. His birth data is in the description below the video. Why is he so smart? Sure, Jupiter in Aquarius in the 8th house is a problem solver, but why is he like the world's most famous problem solver? Well, his 5th lord, house of intelligence, is exalted. That helps. And it's in a niche bhanga Raja Yoga, which means it's in a very powerful combination, which is alleviating the debilitation of another planet by virtue of the fact that it's in a house exchange with Saturn. So his 5th lord is really supercharged, and the 5th lord determines your intellect. Furthermore, it doesn't hurt that his Mercury is near Saturn. It gives a person a scientific intellect. Nor does it hurt that his moon is in the 6th in Sagittarius. Finally, let's talk about Jupiter in Pisces. If Jupiter is in Pisces in the 8th house, it means Leo is rising. And if Leo is rising, it means Jupiter is the 5th and the 8th lords. So again, the skeptical nature of Jupiter in the 8th is highlighted by the fact that the 5th and the 8th lord in the 8th also indicates a person that's skeptical and looks deeper than the surface and has a lot of insight. Furthermore, Jupiter in Pisces also highlights this because Jupiter in Pisces signifies having a lot of intelligence. So we can describe Jupiter in Pisces in the 8th house as indicating a person who has contemplative incisiveness. It's not really an aggressive incisiveness because of Pisces. Also, the sexual vitality of Jupiter in the 8th is highlighted by the fact that the 5th and the 8th lords in the 8th house is very sexy, and Jupiter in Pisces is very fertile and creative. So Jupiter in Pisces 8th house indicates people who are fertily creative and have a lot of appeal. Our example of this is Tina Turner. Her birth data is in the description below. So why is she a performer and a musician? Okay, Jupiter in Pisces in the 8th house gives you sex appeal, but doesn't give you any musical skill. Sure, it comes from other things in her chart. As I say, always watch the 11th, 5th, and 3rd house for musicians. In her case, her 11th lord Venus and her 3rd lord Mercury join in the 5th house with the 1st lord. And it doesn't hurt that her moon is also in the 11th house. Tina Turner was also not just a performer, but very sexy and charismatic. Why? How would you see that in this chart? Her Jupiter in the 8th is in a Raja Yoga as the 5th lord joining the 9th and the 4th lord, Mars. So it's giving power to that house of sexiness and that house of charisma. And by the way, this also affects or is expressed in her voice because it affects Jupiter and it aspects her 2nd house. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdekara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, your nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding.